Hi, my name is Kyla Coles, and I'm going to be presenting on a paper called Frankenstein Advanced Wireless Fuzzing to Exploit New Bluetooth Escalation Targets. Wireless protocols like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are used in many devices from smartphones, smartwatches, to headphones, making them prime targets for cyber attacks. However, traditional security testing methods like over-the-air fuzzing are slow and inefficient, leaving many vulnerabilities undiscovered. Frankenstein, an advanced fuzzing framework, overcomes these challenges by emulating firmware, essentially bringing it back to life, allowing direct packet injection, and significantly improving vulnerability detection. The paper I'm presenting focuses specifically on applying Frankenstein to the Bluetooth protocol. And to help you understand how Frankenstein works, I'll start by covering a few key concepts that are important. So one of the key concepts in Frankenstein's approach is fuzzing, specifically coverage-guided mutational fuzzing. And so fuzzing is a dynamic analysis technique where unexpected or invalid inputs are intentionally sent to trigger some unexpected behavior. And this is in order to uncover security vulnerabilities. However, traditional fuzzing is slow and inefficient because it often generates completely random inputs without any feedback on what parts of the code are actually being tested. And this is why Frankenstein uses coverage-guided mutational fuzzing. Instead of generating entirely random inputs, coverage-guided mutational fuzzing modifies existing inputs, known as mutations, while using feedback from the program execution in order to determine which code paths have been covered. In this paper, Frankenstein applies this fuzzing method to ensure that as many code paths as possible are tested, again, because the goal is to find as many vulnerabilities as possible with security testing. Another key concept is the Bluetooth protocol. As I mentioned in one of the previous slides, the authors of this paper focused on applying their framework to Bluetooth. So before I get into the details of Frankenstein, it's important to understand the basics of Bluetooth. So the Bluetooth protocol stack is structured into multiple layers, each responsible for different functions from user applications to radio signals. It contains four main components: the application component, which is where users' applications exist; the host, which is the operating system, which manages higher level protocols; the host controller interface, which is in between the host and controller. This acts as a communication bridge between the host and controller. And in the Bluetooth stack that we're evaluating in this paper, it's transmitted over UART. And then the last component is the controller, which is the chip that runs the firmware. And so within these components, there are different protocols. Within the controller, there's the physical layer, which is responsible for actual transmission over air. The link layer is responsible for advertising, scanning, and creating and maintaining connections. And then within the host layer, there's L2CAP, which is Logic, Link, Control, and Adaptation Protocol. It provides data encapsulation and ensures data integrity. Some Security Manager Protocol ensures that there's security, a secure connection between two Bluetooth devices. The Attribute Protocol, which ensures that data is stored and accessed between devices. GATT, otherwise known as Generic Attribute Profile, which structures the data exchanged in Bluetooth. And then GAP, Generic Access Profile, which has everything to do with how Bluetooth devices form connections with one another. So next, I will give a high-level overview on how Frankenstein works. So Frankenstein is a wireless communication firmware fuzzing framework that tests vulnerabilities without real hardware, also known as emulation. In the paper, the authors focus specifically on fuzzing the Bluetooth protocol, as said before. Frankenstein works by taking a snapshot of real Bluetooth firmware running on a physical device, emulating it in KeyMove, the emulator, and injecting fuzz packets into the firmware. As you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram, the authors use a Broadcom Bluetooth development board as the Bluetooth controller, and it has two interfaces, a serial interface and a radio interface. And the serial interface uses UART, which represents the host controller interface, or HCI, that's used to communicate with the Linux host, the operating system. The radio interface uses Bluetooth signals, which represent the communication between the controller and the modem. So basically, it's the communication between two different Bluetooth devices. In order to emulate the physical system, Frankenstein takes a snapshot of the running firmware, sends it to the Linux host, and runs the emulation there using QEMU in user mode. And the emulated firmware is attached to the Linux host Bluetooth stack. So then in this emulation, the serial interface is replaced by a pseudo terminal, and the radio interface is replaced by using fake input-output registers, allowing fuzz inputs to be injected directly. And so by doing this, Frankenstein allows us to see how the host system and firmware interact, allowing for more effective fuzzing, also known as full stack fuzzing. So next, I'll go into more detail about how Frankenstein works. Frankenstein brings firmware dumps back to life in a different environment, hence the name. By snapshotting and emulating Bluetooth firmware, it allows researchers to analyze firmware without requiring any physical hardware. As you can see on the diagram, Frankenstein patches the physical firmware to add hooks for taking snapshots, extracting memory, and preserving the system state. Meanwhile, in emulation, it patches the firmware to replace, disable, and hook functions to compensate for missing hardware and to add debug statements. To modify the firmware at runtime, Frankenstein rewrites function prologues in a few different ways. So in order to disable functions, the function prologue is overwritten to cause the function to return immediately. In order to replace functions, the function prologue, again, is overwritten to jump to a new target function. And in order to add hooks, again, the function prologue is modified to branch to custom code. And this allows for other capabilities like tracing function calls, analyzing interrupt handlers, and analyzing status registers. As I said in the previous slide, Frankenstein makes patches to the physical chip's firmware to take a snapshot. So first, it adds a hook called map memory, which initially just sweeps through the entire memory address range, so we have a layout. Then it takes a snapshot by adding a hook called eximit state. This hook pauses interrupts and disables timers while copying the memory through HCI. And as you can see in the image, the contents copied contain ROM, RAM, and memory mapped I/O. Since the snapshot of the firmware is captured as a raw binary file, it needs to be converted into a format that can be executed within the emulator. And so this involves multiple steps. First, converting the raw binary snapshot into an object file, then linking it to C code and a list of symbols that represent known functions and addresses within the firmware, and then linking everything into an ELF file, which is the standard format for executables in Linux. And then the ELF file is able to run in QEMU. As said before, the C code plays an important role in modifying the firmware dynamically. When the ELF file starts executing, the C code runs first, applying the necessary changes such as installing hooks, rewriting functions, replacing missing hardware interactions, etc. Once these modifications are applied, execution continues as if it were running on the real hardware. Memory corruption is one of the most common and dangerous types of vulnerabilities in firmware. Heap overflows, use after free vulnerabilities, memory leaks, these can all lead to remote code execution. And to detect and analyze these vulnerabilities, Frankenstein includes a heap sanitizer, which is a debugging tool that hooks into the firmware's memory management functions. It works by, like I said before, hooking memory allocation and deallocation functions to track memory usage, and then logs the memory-related vulnerabilities to the pseudo terminal, where security researchers can analyze. So, you might be wondering how fuzz packets are actually sent. Well, the authors of Frankenstein create a virtual modem by adding hooks that allow them to inject packets directly into the firmware. And this virtual modem makes fuzzing more efficient and controlled because instead of relying on physical hardware transmission, it directly writes packets to RAM using a technique called direct memory access, or DMA. And normally in the physical world, a packet is delivered to another device by being modulated onto a radio wave, transmitted over the air, and received by another Bluetooth chip, and then processed by its firmware. But in Frankenstein, the virtual modem bypasses all this by writing the packet directly to the receive buffer in RAM. Once the packet is in RAM, um, setting two registers triggers the Bluetooth core scheduler's interrupt handler. As you can see in the image at the bottom right, the red Bluetooth core int is the interrupt, and it activates the Bluetooth core schedule kernel. From there, the Bluetooth core scheduler activates a task and determines where the packet should go. So, for example, ACL packets are forwarded to the Bluetooth transport thread, whereas link management protocol packets are transported to the link manager thread. Okay, so now that we've covered how Frankenstein works, let's take a look at the fuzzing results. Using the Frankenstein virtual modem, researchers were able to uncover a total of three heap overflow vulnerabilities, a coexistence vulnerability and the Android blue flag vulnerability. As shown in the diagram, the virtual modem injected different types of fuzz data into the firmware, included, including extended inquiry response, EIR packets, Bluetooth low energy data packets, and ACL data. These fuzz inputs led to the discovery of three heap overflow vulnerabilities. And interestingly enough, two additional vulnerabilities were identified, including a Wi-Fi coexistence issue and another undetermined system level issue. The most impactful discovery, in my opinion, was the blue flag vulnerability, which allows remote code execution on Android devices. Now, let's take a deeper look at actually how these vulnerabilities occur. The first heap overflow vulnerability found on the Broadcom firmware was CVE 2019-1156, and this vulnerability occurs when a device scans for nearby Bluetooth devices. Normally, these devices respond with an extended inquiry response, or EIR, packet containing additional information. However, Frankenstein discovered that the firmware improperly handles EIR packets, leading to a heap overflow. So, as you can see in the diagram, the ACL payload header contains a 10-bit length field that specifies the amount of data to be copied over to an host controller interface event buffer. A 3-bit reserved for future use, or RFU field, follows the length field, and this should always be set to 0. However, the firmware mistakenly includes the RFU bits in the packet length calculation. And so if these bits are non-zero, the calculated length will exceed the actual buffer size, causing a heap overflow. So to uncover this flaw, Frankenstein sent a fuzzed EIR packet to the emulator firmware, triggering the vulnerability. Once exploited, an attacker could use a what-where gadget to achieve arbitrary memory write and then further escalating the attack. The next heap overflow vulnerability found in Broadcom firmware was CVE 2019-13916, which affects Bluetooth low energy packet processing. And this vulnerability occurs when a Bluetooth low energy packet is received and copied into a heap block buffer. However, the buffer is allocated 3 bytes too small to hold the maximum 255 byte packet data unit plus its 12-byte header. Therefore, an attacker can corrupt the pointer adjacent to the buffer, as shown in the diagram. And the last three bytes of the packet data unit and the first byte of the CRC get copied into the pointer. This means an attacker can carefully craft the last three bytes of the packet data unit and manipulate the first byte of the CRC. Since the first byte of the CRC is derived from the packet data unit, an attacker can control what gets written into the pointer easily. So by exploiting this flaw, an attacker can overwrite the pointer to any arbitrary memory address. Once this happens, any incoming Bluetooth low energy packet will be written to that address, resulting in a write what where condition. The last heap overflow vulnerability found was CVE 2019-18614, which stems from a misconfiguration of a global variable that defines the ACL packet length. In the Broadcom firmware, the global variable is incorrectly set to 384 bytes, while the actual hardware, the Broadcom chip, is designed to handle 1021 bytes. And this mismatch creates a heap overflow condition when data exceeding 384 bytes is copied, leading to memory corruption. This vulnerability can be triggered in two ways. One, by simply setting up a Bluetooth headset for audio streaming, causing the overflow to occur, and two, over the air by sending L2 ping packets exceeding 384 bytes. Broadcom combo chips are designed to handle both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth communication simultaneously, running on two separate processor cores. Since both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth operate in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band, they must coordinate spectrum access in order to prevent interference. This coordination mechanism is also known as coexistence. However, Frankenstein uncovered a way to exploit this mechanism to cause a denial of service or DOS attack on Wi-Fi. So this vulnerability allows an attacker to manipulate the coexistence registers by Bluetooth, disrupting Wi-Fi functionality. On some devices, this interference is severe enough to cause a kernel panic, which occurs when the operating system encounters a critical error it can't recover from, causing the device to crash. Frankenstein takes advantage of this flaw by intentionally writing to those registers, demonstrating how Bluetooth can be leveraged to interfere with Wi-Fi connectivity, and in extreme cases, crash the entire system. While testing CVE 2019-18614, the authors attempted to trigger a heap overflow by sending L2 cap fragments. However, instead of just causing an overflow, they unexpectedly crashed the Bluetooth daemon running on an Android device. This crash led to the discovery of a far more severe vulnerability, a remote code execution vulnerability, which they named BlueFrag. And BlueFrag allows an unauthenticated attacker within Bluetooth range, about 30 feet, to execute arbitrary code on a target device. And to demonstrate its impact, the authors developed a proof of concept that successfully exploited the vulnerability and a control flow integrity bypass to gain a shell on the compromised device. This vulnerability is eventually reported and patched, but it just highlights how fuzzing Bluetooth implementations can uncover severe vulnerabilities that attackers could exploit remotely. So now that we've covered the vulnerabilities discovered using Frankenstein, let's dig into the code coverage results of fuzzing. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, one of the goals of fuzzing in Frankenstein is to maximize code coverage to uncover hidden bugs in the Bluetooth firmware. This table breaks down how different fuzzing methods contributed to overall code coverage. So the first, LMP fuzzing, or a link management protocol fuzzing. So this directly targets the link management protocol, which is responsible for handling Bluetooth device connections and authentication. It covered 2.76% of the code. LMP fuzzing with HCI. This extends the link management protocol fuzzing by incorporating higher level host controller interface commands, which trigger additional host controller interface handlers and UART. And that was about 0.56% code covered. And then the rest of the remaining commands are HCI attach commands. And this basically it attaches Frankenstein to the Linux Bluetooth stack, allowing interaction with the firmware using tools like HCI tool and HCI config. And all of those total together covered about 9.4% of the code. So over 90% of the total Bluetooth firmware code has yet to be analyzed. However, the achieved code coverage is still significant because the size of the fuzzed components within the Bluetooth specification is large. For example, the link management protocol makes up only about 4% of the entire Bluetooth specification. Yet, Frankenstein managed to cover approximately 3.3% of the total firmware code just through link management protocol fuzzing. So this demonstrates that this fuzzing approach can achieve high impact results even with limited overall code coverage. Now that we've examined Frankenstein's vulnerability findings and code coverage results, let's discuss some potential mitigation strategies. One, turning off Bluetooth when not in use seems like a simple solution, but unfortunately, it's not always effective. Some vulnerabilities can still be exploited even when Bluetooth is disabled. As long as the firmware remains active and no full hardware reset has been performed, it can still be vulnerable. Bluetooth firmware is stored in ROM for the Broadcom chip, meaning it cannot be modified after production. So, to apply updates, Broadcom relies on a patching mechanism called patch RAM, but this comes with significant limitations. Some Bluetooth controllers don't have available patch slots, making them impossible to fix. And patches must be ported individually for each chipset model, leading to long delays in security updates. And older devices are even worse off because they often never receive security updates at all, leaving them permanently vulnerable. And finally, modern security mechanisms like data execution prevention or DEP, which prevents executing code from non-executable memory, and ASLR or address space layout randomization, which randomizes memory addresses, are critical for mitigating memory corruption attacks. However, none of the Bluetooth firmware analyzed in this research implemented these protections, making them highly susceptible to memory corruption exploits. This lack of basic mitigations makes Bluetooth firmware an easy target for attackers. So, as we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, wireless protocols like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are deeply integrated into current devices that we have. So, smartphones, smartwatches, headphones. Their widespread use makes them prime targets for cyber attacks. Traditional over-the-air fuzzing is limited by hardware constraints and is inefficient. By emulating firmware and bringing it back to life, allows for faster, more controlled fuzzing without relying on physical Bluetooth hardware. This approach helped discover 5 critical vulnerabilities, including heap overflows, a coexistent vulnerability, and BlueFrag, the Android vulnerability. Additionally, Frankenstein achieved 9.4% code coverage, which may seem low, but it is actually significant given the size of the Bluetooth spec. This demonstrates that Frankenstein can still give impactful results even without full code coverage. And finally, many vulnerabilities persist because Broadcom's Bluetooth firmware is stored in ROM, making it difficult to patch after deployment. Also, lack of modern security mechanisms like DEP and ASLR leaves devices vulnerable to memory corruption attacks. So ultimately, this research highlights the urgent need for continued advancements in wireless protocol security testing. Frankenstein provides a powerful approach to address these challenges, paving the way for a more secure future for wireless communications.